Charles Darwin, Sigmund Freud, biographical information for them, and the key ideas that we see from them, or key contributions we see from them, and then we'll go from there. About ready? Darwin? Yeah, ready with Darwin? Let's jump in. Let's start with Darwin. We'll move on to Freud here in a second. Okay, so we're looking at Charles Darwin here. I think all of us are familiar with Darwin to some extent. Yes? Okay. We may not be fans of what he did and his work and his ideas, but we're at least familiar with him and his work here. So when is Darwin born? What year? 1809. And he dies 1882. Okay. What is his primary contribution to the world? Natural selection that comes from his work titled On the Origin of Species. And in On the Origin of Species, he details out what he calls the process of natural selection. Okay, question. What is natural selection? Survival of the fittest. Okay. 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 Traits for living things are passed on and selected by nature. Because the traits that help a creature survive get passed on to the generation. If you're born with a set of traits that kills you off, then those traits don't get passed on because you end up dead, right? Okay, so his point here is, hey, traits in animals are passed on through animals more fit to survive their habitat. Yes? Am I doing justice to what he says? Okay. Making some semblance of sense there? Okay, good. So then, those traits, hang on. 1 second. Okay. Those traits get passed on by the animals that survive that habitat. Where does Darwin witness this? Galapagos Islands. What animals does he observe in the Galapagos? Finches and some turtles, right? Shell shape, size, right? Adaptations of shells to certain Galapagos turtles. And then wing shape and size, beak shape and size, right? Adaptations to finch species in various islands of the Galapagos. And he says, okay, so in certain habitats of the Galapagos, these traits to these finches mean better survival, and these traits over here mean better survival, and these traits over there mean better, right? So animals adapt to their environment, and those adaptations get passed on because they make those animals better fit to survive their habitats. Yeah? Okay. So what he discovered is what we call microevolution. Creatures change in small ways within their own species group to adapt to different habitats those animals find themselves in, right? So beak, shape, and size in certain species of finches is different because the habitats have minor variations to them, and so the finches adapt to their environment. Yeah? Okay. Dogs. Canine species, right? Variation in canines can, in some sense, be described by variation in habitat. Are you with me? Are we okay with that idea? Mm-hmm. That one's pretty hard to ignore because that happens across the board, right? Everything adapts to its environment. Okay. Darwin says, okay, if creatures make modifications based on the needs of their environment within a species, then perhaps at some point, those small changes will add up to more substantial ones. Right? Instead of just changing minor character traits like beak or shell, Perhaps over time, minor variations will add up to be body modifications, skeletal structure modifications, right? Darwin is extrapolating. This is his argument. He doesn't have evidence that this has taken place. That's not what he's saying in Origin of Species. He's saying, I see this, and maybe if there's enough of that and enough time, it'll get to that. Does that make sense? Does it work? The deal is, we don't know how much time you need, because we still don't have fossil records with enough minor changes to link us from one species to a different species. What we don't have in the fossil record are the little finches from the Galapagos Islands becoming eagles. We don't see that kind of body change, right? We don't see cows becoming manatees because you put them in a more waterlogged environment. I'm playing on that sea cow thing. Are you with me on that? We don't see that. There's not a progression in the fossil record that shows us that kind of change. But this is what he's arguing for. Maybe we just need more time. Maybe we don't have the right changes yet. This is what he's talking about, though. He observes this and extrapolates from that observation that maybe this is possible too. And what would that get you? That would get you the origin of species. You could effectively then start with one thing, and from that one thing you started with, expand your way out into a whole bunch of other stuff. Yeah? What Darwin provides the world, whether he intended it to be this way or not, is a way to explain the natural world without God. We don't need God to account for different species. All I need is a sequence of species development. These creatures to these creatures to these creatures to these creatures to dogs to horses to whatever. Right? Monkeys to people. That's what we need. Now there's a viable possibility that we could explain the world around us without needing God. Without needing a kind of, even an Aristotelian unmoved mover who's standoffish and just started the clock and has thrown the clock out the window to watch time fly. We don't even need that anymore. All we need is a natural process. We don't need some supernatural intervention. We don't need any of that. We just need the process and enough time and chance to make it work. You don't need God to explain the world around us. That's the philosophic impact of what Darwin does for us. Yeah? I think we're pretty comfortable with that as far as like we're used to hearing it. Yeah? Okay. So let's shift gears and let's talk about Sigmund Freud. Rough living. All right, if you didn't get to it yet, go to it now. Some biographical stuff and some big picture ideas. What do we get from Freud? Let's do that. And then I'm going to go back and forth with you guys doing some research and some digging as we talk through what Freud is talking about. Sigmund Freud. brief biographical sketch, key contributions and ideas from Freud. Just a smidgen more time here, and then we'll jump in. Talk through Freud. Ready? Let's do a little with Freud. When is he born? 1856. 1856? That's the year? Yeah? Okay. Sorry, it just sounded odd. I know it's right. It just sounded odd. That's why I reacted that way. Sorry. So 1856, and he dies? 1939. You saw a good portion of the stuff we're talking about as this reactionism, whatever, in postmodernism. So 1856 to 1939. What is his contribution to the world? Psychoanalysis, right. He is referred to as the father of psychoanalytic theory, or the father of psychoanalysis. Okay? What is psychoanalysis? Break it down into two words. Analyzing the it's more than the brain. The mind, yeah, the psyche, right? It's analyzing the human psyche, breaking down what's going on in the human mind and trying to understand how the mind works. This is what he's attempting to do. So he's answering all of our Renaissance philosophers set us up for this, yeah? There's the brain, but then there's the mind, and there's this intellectual thing that is the mind, and it reasons, and it has these capacities to it, right? That are connected to the brain, but they're more than that. So he goes, okay, so what is this mind? Let's talk about it. What it is? Let's figure it out. What's his basic idea in psychoanalysis? Louder. Okay, there's stuff in our mind we're not aware of. It's not conscious. Okay, what else? If there's stuff in your mind you're not aware of, then what has to happen? Somebody's got to make you aware of it. How does that happen? Not quite. Not initially for Freud. All you gotta do is talk. Just talk it out. Specifically, you gotta talk about your dreams. Right? Because what Freud argues is while you're dreaming, your conscious mind turns off and your subconscious or your unconscious mind goes to work and has a heyday. So all the stuff you're not aware of during the day, your brain is working on at night and it shows up in dreams. It's your mind, not your brain, it's your mind working on what's not available to you in conscious thought. Maybe for a myriad of reasons. Good with me there? Okay. I need you to do a search. Well, actually, everybody do this one. Diagram, just 3 words. Diagram, Freud, mind. Diagram, Freud, mind. Yeah, I want the iceberg one. That one was okay. That one will work. That one's pretty good. That one's okay. Yeah, let's use that. Okay, so we've got an iceberg, right? Basic shape of an iceberg. I'm just going to go with a triangle. We got a water line in there somewhere, right? Toward the top or toward the bottom? Toward the top. Very good. We've learned our lesson from Titanic. Okay, good. Okay. What's at the top of the iceberg?
The iceberg is also just like.
What's above the water line? Ooh, the tip of the iceberg. Wow, we're getting specific here. Okay. We're talking about the mind. We're talking about Freud's diagram for the mind. So we need Freud's labels for the parts here. There's 2 parts that belong above the water line. What is available to, yeah, okay, so let's do it this way. Now I can't spell it. Somebody spell conscious.
C-O-N-C-I-O-U-S.
Dang it! Had it right the first time. It's right above it, and I still almost misspelled it again. Okay? Stop it. All right. So there's the conscious mind, what we're aware of. I know I'm thinking about talking about Freud. So this is what I'm aware of. I'm conscious. Yeah. And then there is the or the unconscious? The stuff I'm not aware of, but it influences behavior patterns and everything else. Good here? Okay. There are three parts, then, that interact with each other in the human mind. What are those three parts? The ego, the superego, and the id. Okay? And so here's how we diagram it. Or at least this is how Miller's going to diagram it. A little part is just a little bit below the waterline. There's a bunch on top. That's the ego. Okay? The stuff over here, a lot under the surface, but there's still some of it up above. We call the superego. And then this mess, all down here below the waterline, we call the id. Okay? Good? Or at least these are the terms Freud uses. Still with me on that? Okay. Mr. Daniels. Now I need you to do a search. Freud and ego. What is the ego according to Freud?
It's the primitive and instinctual part of the mind that,
The ego?
according to Freud's psychedelic theory. Oh, that's not it.
There we go.
The ego is the realistic part that mediates between the desires of the id and the superego.
Okay. I'm going to boil this down to like simple talk. This is the us we show the world. Okay? This is the part of us that gets, and I'm going to use this word strategically, normalized. This is a mediated version of the self between the id and the superego. This is the result. Okay? So the superego says something, the id says something else, and the ego goes, well, it's somewhere in the middle. Right? This is a presentation of self to the world around us. We are conscious of it. I'm aware of my behavior. I may not always change it, but I'm aware of it. Right? Is this making sense to you? Okay, good. So then the superego, Mr. Daniels, what is the superego?
Operates as a moral conscience.
Yeah, this is the normalizer. This is the moral and ethical normalizer. Sometimes that's social customs, it's mores, right? It's polite behavior. This is the part of us that changes what we would otherwise want to do so that is appropriate when we do it. Right? Or it restricts. Nope, that's off limits. Shouldn't do that. That's bad behavior. Right? Or no, that's morally wrong. We shouldn't do that. This is the part of us that says, well, hang on, I want to do this. And it goes, well, but no, you can't because bad. Or you should do this because good. For Freud, good and bad are learned. And primarily learned at a young age as a foundational set at home on the basis of relationships in the home. Right? You with me on this? Okay, so it works like this. Freud says Male children, young boys, compete with their fathers for attention from their mom, right? And based on the way mom interacts with them, both of them, from what the child can see and experience personally, and how dad interacts, right, with the child and with mom, the child then forms patterns of acceptable and not acceptable behavior in relationships in the home. Okay? But Freud's contention is that male children want attention from their mother, primarily. Right? So the way in which their attention seeking from their mom is intercepted by their dad, or encouraged by their mom, or both, or the way in which there's a healthy male-to-male interaction and son-to-mother interaction will determine what is shaped in appropriate behaviors between males and between male and female as that child grows up. Okay? On the flip side, young girls want attention from their dads. And so they compete with the other female in the house, their mother, for attention from their father. This is effectively, for Freud, why you have daddy's girls and mama's boys. Because our first inclination is for attention from the other. Are you tracking with me on this? Okay, so then he says, same thing. Girls, you're going to compete with your mom and other females in the household for attention from your father. It's part of the human instinct and drive to get attention from the opposite gender. So you're going to start that process at a very young age, like 3 to 5 years old. And the way in which those interactions take place in the house will shape the superego to determine what's appropriate and what's not appropriate behavior. And so the modifier starts early. If something goes awry with the modification, then you end up in a situation, and this is for Freud, really core and really hard to deal with, okay? You end up in a situation where sons grow up with an Oedipus complex, being, quote, in love with their mother, and daughters grow up with an Electra complex, being in love with their fathers. Electra being Oedipus's mother, right? Okay. And you end up with inappropriate relationship boundaries and inappropriate moral shapers for behavior because it's not modeled and patterned properly. And for Freud, it's all learned behavior. There's nothing internal about it. Is it making sense? Questions on that at this point? Okay, so here's the deal. For Freud, morality and ethics are learned patterns of acceptable behavior. Okay? So when children have healthy relational and appropriate behavior dynamics modeled, patterned, exemplified, and taught, then the superego becomes a normalizer for appropriate social behavior and morality and ethics. Because it has to mediate what's in the id. This is where we're going now. So what's the id?
The id is the primitive and instinctual part of the mind that contains sexual and aggressive drives and hidden memories.
Okay. This is all instinct and drive. It's all instinct and drive. There are two key components for Freud in this. The first of them you mentioned in this read-off is sexuality, and the second one is aggression. Because Freud understands that human persons go for what they want, right? Unless something mediates the pursuit, we'll just go and take it. Just watch a toddler with toys. This is Freud's point, right? Unless something mediates to the toddler, that's not okay. The toddler will just grow up taking what it wants and become an adult who just takes, and that's not good, right? Aggression and sexuality, both included in that full description of what Freud's going to play out. Tracking with me on this to this point. Okay, so here's the deal. He basically says this: humanity is selfish, concerned with its own pleasure and its own survival. Sounds a lot like this, doesn't it? It's this applied to this. What Freud is picking up on is a naturalistic understanding of what the human person is. Basically, a mind with evolutionary drives that have to be mediated because people live together. But here's what happens. If something happens to us that is unpleasant or painful or difficult, the superego takes it from the conscious and buries it in the id. That makes sense? So then later on, when something sparks what's going on in the subconscious mind, you react not to what's going on consciously, but to what's buried subconsciously. That's Freud's theory. We respond not to what happens up here, but what has happened down here. So something up here reminds you of this, and your brain grabs it and makes you react. Brain, your mind. Without you being aware of the fact that that is what you're reacting to. There's actually a recent sort of verification to this. They did a study on individuals who, as children, experienced some set of trauma and observed their reactions to similar stimuli later in life. And what they found is individuals who experienced trauma at a young age, who then experienced something similar later, reacted like the age they first experienced the trauma. It's Freud. So if you encountered this thing down here that was hard, difficult, painful, traumatizing, whatever, as a 6-year-old, then when you experience something up here as a 20-year-old, your tendency as a human person is to react like a 6-year-old, not like a 20-year-old, because you haven't dealt with this one yet. So your 6-year-old self is still reacting. Does that make sense? This is Freud's whole point. Where does that leave us? It leaves us with it. What Freud's basically diagrammed is we don't even know ourselves. We don't. And if we can't know ourselves, how do we know any? Because some vast percentage of what's going on in your mind is actually totally inaccessible to you. The reason you react or get frustrated with this or with that or with whatever, you may not even be aware of. But you're still reacting to it, even if you're not aware of it. So if that's the case and you don't understand yourself, then how are you supposed to know anything? Because what's available to us is so minute and so mediated. What are we supposed to do? Now, Freud's point is on this evolutionary model. If we start with this evolutionary understanding, then humanity is just a big ball of instinct that has to be mediated so we play nicely with other people. But the philosophic impact is basically this. If humanity is that, then humanity doesn't understand itself. How is it supposed to understand anything else? How is humanity supposed to know God? How is humanity supposed to know if God is real? If humanity can't even figure itself out? That's the challenge. So here's what we got. With Darwin, we can explain the world without God in it. With Freud, do we really know anything? Because we can't even figure out ourselves. We don't even know why we're reacting to things the way we're reacting to things. We need somebody like Freud to break down what's going on in our mind so that we can understand why we respond the way we respond to certain sets of stimuli. Everything at this point is totally uncertain. No? Questions or concerns? No? Good?